It all started on a Saturday morning, the kind where everything feels calm and perfect. The sun was shining brightly, birds were chirping, and I had a steaming cup of coffee in my hand as I sat on my porch. It was one of those moments when life feels simple and peaceful, but that peace didn't last long. Just as I was about to take another sip of my coffee, I heard it, a loud, jarring noise coming from next door. At first, I thought maybe someone was mowing their lawn or doing some construction work, but then I realized what it was, the unmistakable sound of a chainsaw. Curious, I stood up and walked toward the fence that separates my yard from Karen's. And there she was, Karen, my neighbor, standing at the base of my asterisk oak tree with a chainsaw in her hands. My heart sank. That tree wasn't just any tree. It was special. It had been there for years, probably even before I moved into the house. Its branches stretched wide, providing shade to both our yards, and its leaves turned golden every fall, making the whole neighborhood look magical. "Karen," I shouted, trying to get her attention over the roar of the machine. She glanced up briefly, her face flushed from exertion, and gave me a quick wave before turning back to the tree. "What are you doing?" I asked, louder this time. "Oh, don't worry," she said casually, like cutting down someone else's tree was no big deal. "This thing is practically in my backyard anyway. It'll look so much better once it's gone." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Practically in your backyard," I repeated, my voice rising. "That tree is on my asterisk property. You can't just cut it down without asking me." But Karen didn't seem to care. She adjusted her grip on the chainsaw and went right back to work. I wanted to stop her, but I didn't know how. Should I call the police? Would they even care about a tree? Standing there, watching her hack away at something that had been part of my home for so long, I felt completely powerless. As the minutes passed, the tree began to creak and groan under the strain of Karen's relentless cuts. Each sound made my stomach twist tighter. I kept thinking, this isn't going to end well. And I was right. With one final crack, the massive trunk gave way, and the entire tree started to fall. But instead of landing neatly in Karen's yard like she probably planned, it tilted sideways and crashed straight into her house. The impact was deafening. Glass shattered, wood splintered, and dust filled the air. For a moment, everything went silent. Then came the yelling. Karen stormed out of her house, looking absolutely furious. "What did you do?" she screamed, pointing at me like I was the one holding the chainsaw. "Me?" I shot back, my voice shaking with disbelief. "You're the one who decided to play lumberjack without permission." Her face turned bright red, and she started ranting about how the tree was dangerous and how it was only a matter of time before it caused damage anyway. But none of that mattered now. Her beautiful house was ruined, and the tree that had stood tall for decades was lying in pieces, all because Karen hadn't thought things through. Standing there amid the chaos, I couldn't help but wonder how such a quiet morning could spiral out of control so quickly. The crash of the tree hitting Karen's house was like something out of a movie. Only it wasn't entertaining. It was horrifying. 1 second, there was the deafening crack of wood splitting and branches snapping, and the next, chaos erupted. The oak didn't fall cleanly into Karen's yard, as she probably imagined. It tilted sideways, its massive trunk smashing through her living room window. Glass exploded outward, scattering shards across her lawn like glitter. The roof groaned under the weight, and part of the ceiling collapsed inward, leaving a gaping hole where her cozy living space used to be. For a moment, everything went eerily quiet. Even the birds stopped chirping, as if they were processing what had just happened. Then came the noise. Karen's voice, shrill and panicked, cutting through the stillness. "What did you do?" she screamed, pointing an accusing finger at me. Her face was red, her eyes wide with shock and anger. "Me?" I replied, my voice rising in disbelief. "You're the one who decided to play Paul Bunyan without asking permission." She ignored me, pacing back and forth in front of the wreckage like a caged animal. She muttered under her breath, shaking her head, while her hands trembled as she clutched her phone. It was clear she was trying to figure out what to do next, but her usual calm demeanor was completely gone. Instead, she looked like someone who had just realized they'd made a huge mistake, and now everyone was watching. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Some stood silently, their expressions a mix of sympathy and amusement. Others whispered among themselves, speculating about how this could have happened. A few even pulled out their phones to take pictures, which only added to my growing sense of unease. This wasn't just a private disaster anymore. It was turning into a neighborhood spectacle. I wanted to explain myself, to tell them that I hadn't touched the chainsaw, that Karen had acted entirely on her own, but no one seemed interested in hearing my side of the story. To them, I was standing there, the owner of the tree that had just destroyed Karen's house. Guilt by association, as Karen called her insurance company. Pacing furiously and gesturing wildly with her free hand, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. Part of me was angry. How dare she cut down my tree without even consulting me? But another part felt guilty, even though I knew logically that none of this was my fault. Watching her house crumble before my eyes made me realize how much worse things could have been. What if the tree had fallen on someone? Or what if it had hit a power line? The thought sent a chill down my spine. Karen eventually hung up the phone and turned to face me again. "This is your fault," she said firmly, jabbing a finger in my direction. "If you'd just taken care of that thing yourself, none of this would have happened." "My fault?" I repeated, incredulous. "You cut down my tree without permission. How does any of this make sense?" She crossed her arms, her jaw tight. That tree was leaning dangerously close to my property. I was trying to prevent damage, not cause it. Prevent damage. The irony was almost laughable. If anything, her impulsive actions had caused far more harm than the tree ever could have. Standing there, surrounded by broken glass and splintered wood, I couldn't help but wonder how we'd gotten here. How could something as simple as a tree lead to such a mess? The longer we argued, the more I realized that this wasn't just about the tree or the house anymore. It was about pride, blame, and the fragile line between neighbors. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the wreckage, I knew this was only the beginning of a very long day. The argument between Karen and me didn't end with her blaming me for the disaster. If anything, it only got worse as the day wore on. The more she talked, the angrier I became, and the angrier I got, the less willing I was to back down. It felt like we were stuck in a loop, each of us determined to prove the other wrong. Karen kept insisting that the tree had been a ticking time bomb, even though there hadn't been any signs of it being dangerous. "It was leaning toward my house," she exclaimed, throwing her hands up dramatically. What was I supposed to do? Wait for it to fall on its own? "Ask me first," I shot back, my voice rising. "That tree was on my property, not yours. You didn't have the right to touch it." She rolled her eyes, which only made me angrier. "Oh, please, like you would have done anything about it. You've ignored that thing for years." "Ignored it?" I repeated, stunned. "I loved that tree. It wasn't just some random plant. It was part of my home. And now it's gone because you decided to take matters into your own hands." Karen crossed her arms and glared at me. "Well, maybe if you'd paid attention to it earlier, none of this would have happened." Her words stung, but they also made me question myself. Had I neglected the tree? Should I have noticed if it really was leaning too far? But then I shook off the doubt. No, this wasn't my fault. Even if the tree had needed trimming or even removal, Karen should have discussed it with me before grabbing a chainsaw. Her actions weren't just reckless, they were disrespectful. As the hours passed, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The tree wasn't coming back, and Karen's house was a mess. Shattered glass covered her lawn, and the gaping hole in her living room wall exposed the inside of her home to anyone who walked by. Neighbors continued to gather, their whispers growing louder as they speculated about what had happened. Some offered sympathy to Karen, while others gave me sideways glances, clearly unsure whose side to take. By late afternoon, Karen announced that she was calling her insurance company again. "They'll handle this," she said confidently, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure how things would play out. I could tell she was nervous, but she tried to mask it with bravado. "And don't think you're off the hook," she added, pointing at me. "You're going to hear from them too." Great, I thought. Just what I needed. A call from an insurance adjuster asking questions I didn't have answers to. Would they blame me for the damage since the tree technically belonged to me? Or would they side with Karen, considering she was the one who cut it down without permission? The uncertainty gnawed at me. Mark, my husband, tried to reassure me when he got home from work. "It'll be fine," he said, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "Insurance will figure it out." But I wasn't so sure. This wasn't just about money or repairs. It was about principle. Karen had overstepped a boundary, and now we were both dealing with the consequences. Worse still, our once cordial relationship was completely shattered. Every glance, every comment, felt loaded with tension. That evening, as I sat on my porch, staring at the empty space where the oak tree used to stand, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss. The shade it provided, the way its leaves rustled in the wind, all of it was gone. And for what? A misunderstanding, a lack of communication, and a whole lot of pride. The worst part was knowing that this fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The insurance process turned out to be even more complicated than I had imagined. Both Karen and I filed claims, but the lines were blurry. Whose responsibility was this mess, really? Technically, the tree belonged to me, so I might bear some liability for its existence. But Karen had been the one to cut it down without permission, which directly caused the damage to her house. It was a legal gray area, and neither of us knew how things would shake out. Karen seemed convinced that I should shoulder most of the blame. "If you just maintained your property properly," she said during one of our tense conversations, "none of this would have happened." Her tone was sharp, like she was trying to guilt me into agreeing with her. But I wasn't about to roll over and accept responsibility for something I hadn't done. Maintain my property. I shot back, my frustration bubbling over. "I didn't see any signs that the tree was dangerous. You're the one who decided to play chainsaw expert and ended up destroying your own house. How does that make sense?" She clenched her jaw, clearly irritated. "Well, if you'd taken care of it earlier, I wouldn't have had to step in." It was infuriating, the way she twisted everything around to make it sound like it was all my fault. Every time we talked, or argued, it felt like we were going in circles. Neither of us was willing to budge, and the tension between us grew thicker with each passing day. Meanwhile, the insurance companies exchanged emails and paperwork, dragging their feet as they tried to sort through the mess. I kept getting updates from my agent, but nothing was clear-cut. They wanted photos, estimates, witness statements, anything to piece together what had happened. Karen did the same on her end, though she made sure to tell me every detail, as if reminding me constantly that this whole ordeal was somehow still my problem. At home, Mark tried to mediate. He's always been the calm one in our relationship, the voice of reason when emotions run high. One evening, after another heated phone call with my insurance agent, he sat me down at the kitchen table. "Look," he said gently, "I know this is frustrating, but maybe we should consider covering part of the cleanup costs, just to keep the peace." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "Are you serious? Karen destroyed her own house. Why should we pay for anything?" "I'm not saying it's fair," he replied, holding up his hands. "But think about it. If we offer to help with the cleanup, it might ease some of the tension. Maybe Karen will back off a little." I shook my head, crossing my arms. "No way. This isn't about money. It's about accountability. She needs to own up to what she did." Mark sighed, knowing there was no point in pushing further. Deep down, I knew he had a point. Prolonging the argument wasn't doing either of us any good. But I couldn't bring myself to give in. Not yet. Every time I thought about Karen standing there with that chainsaw, hacking away at my asterisk tree, my blood boiled. How could I let her off the hook after everything? As the days dragged on, the stress began to wear on me. I found myself replaying the incident over and over in my mind, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Should I have noticed that the tree was leaning too far? Should I have talked to Karen sooner about her concerns? But then I reminded myself, none of this would have happened if she'd simply asked before taking matters into her own hands. The uncertainty weighed heavily on both of us. Karen's house remained partially exposed, covered with a tarp until repairs could begin. And my yard, once shaded by the majestic oak, now felt empty and bare. The absence of the tree was a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong, and how far apart Karen and I had grown. Every interaction between us became colder, more formal. We avoided eye contact when we passed each other outside, and small talk was completely off the table. What had once been a neighborly relationship, even if it wasn't particularly close, had deteriorated into icy silence. It was exhausting, carrying all that resentment day after day. But I didn't know how to fix it. Not while Karen refused to take responsibility for her actions. By the end of the week, I realized something important. This fight wasn't just about a tree or a damaged house. It was about pride, boundaries, and the fragile line between neighbors. And unless something changed, it was only going to get worse. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, Greg stepped in. Greg was our neighbor 2 doors down, a retired mechanic with a gruff exterior but a surprisingly soft heart. He wasn't the type to meddle in other people's business, but he'd been watching the drama unfold between Karen and me, and apparently he'd decided enough was enough. One evening, as I sat on my porch staring at the empty spot where the oak tree used to be, Greg appeared at my gate holding a 6-pack of beer. "We need to fix this before it gets uglier," he declared, plopping himself onto my porch chair without waiting for an invitation. His tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. I raised an eyebrow, half amused and half annoyed. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" I asked skeptically. "Karen won't even look at me anymore." Greg smirked, cracking open a can of beer and handing it to me. "Leave that to me. I've got a plan." The next morning, true to his word, Greg showed up at Karen's doorstep armed with cookies baked by his wife and a surprisingly diplomatic attitude. I didn't know what he said to her. Greg never told me the details, but whatever it was worked. By the time he left, Karen had reluctantly agreed to meet me halfway. Literally. We were to convene in Greg's driveway later that afternoon, surrounded by curious neighbors who couldn't resist the chance to witness some kind of resolution. When the time came, I walked over to Greg's house feeling a mix of dread and hope. Karen arrived moments later, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She avoided making eye contact with me, focusing instead on the ground or the fence behind Greg's yard. The tension was palpable, like static electricity hanging in the air. Greg stood between us, acting as an unofficial mediator. "All right," he began, his voice calm but firm. "Let's cut to the chase. This has gone on long enough. Both of you are good people, but pride is getting in the way. So here's the deal. We're going to figure this out today, one way or another." Karen frowned, clearly unimpressed by his bluntness. "I already told you, it's her tree that caused all this," she muttered under her breath. "And I already told you. I shot back, my patience wearing thin, that you're the one who cut it down without permission." Greg held up a hand, silencing both of us. "Enough. Neither of you is entirely blameless here, so let's stop pointing fingers and start talking solutions." He turned to Karen first. "You acted impulsively, and now your house is damaged. That's not ideal, but it's also not entirely someone else's fault. Own your part of this mess." Then he looked at me. "And you should have addressed Karen's concerns about the tree sooner. Ignoring a problem doesn't make it go away. His words stung, but deep down, I knew he was right. I hadn't handled the situation perfectly either. As much as I hated to admit it, maybe if I'd been more proactive, none of this would have happened. Once Greg had laid everything out on the table, he suggested we come up with a compromise. After hours of tense discussion, and several rounds of lemonade brought out by Greg's ever-patient wife, we finally reached an agreement. Karen would drop her claim against me, acknowledging that she'd acted recklessly. In return, I agreed to cover part of the cleanup costs for the tree debris. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As we shook hands, awkwardly, hesitantly, I felt a small flicker of relief. Maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was finally coming to an end. But as I glanced at the empty space where the oak tree once stood, I couldn't help but wonder if our relationship would ever truly recover. The compromise we reached in Greg's driveway felt like a fragile truce rather than a real resolution. Karen agreed to drop her claim against me, which meant I wouldn't have to worry about being held financially responsible for the damage to her house. In return, I offered to cover part of the cleanup costs for the tree debris. A gesture that was more symbolic than anything else. It wasn't about the money. It was about showing some goodwill and proving that I wasn't completely unwilling to meet her halfway. But even as we shook hands, there was an undeniable awkwardness between us. The handshake itself was stiff, almost robotic, like two strangers forced into politeness rather than neighbors who had once exchanged pleasantries over backyard fences. Karen muttered a quick thanks before hurrying back to her house, leaving me standing in Greg's driveway with a mix of relief and lingering frustration. Later that evening, I sat on my porch, staring at the empty space where the oak tree used to stand. The absence of its sprawling branches and rustling leaves felt heavier than I expected. That tree had been more than just a plant. It had been a living piece of my home, a quiet companion during lazy afternoons and stormy nights. Now, all that remained was a patch of bare earth and a scattering of sawdust left behind by Karen's chainsaw. Mark joined me outside, handing me a cup of tea. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly, sitting beside me. I sighed, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "I don't know. Relieved, I guess, but also sad and frustrated." He nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. "It'll take time," he said, "for both of you." And he was right. While the immediate crisis seemed to be over, the fallout from the incident lingered. Karen and I weren't exactly enemies anymore, but we weren't friends either. Our interactions, if they could even be called that, were polite but distant. She avoided eye contact when she saw me, and I did the same. The tension had eased slightly, but the rift between us was still painfully obvious. Karen's house slowly began to heal. Her insurance covered most of the repairs, though she grumbled about the deductible every chance she got. Contractors came and went, replacing the shattered windows, fixing the roof, and repainting the damaged siding. Each hammer strike and saw buzz reminded me of how much destruction one impulsive decision could cause. Watching her house come back together made me hopeful that maybe, someday, our relationship might too. Still, the emotional scars ran deep for both of us. Every time I passed Karen's yard, I couldn't help but think about the argument and the chaos that followed. It was hard not to feel resentment bubbling up, even though I knew holding on to it wouldn't do me any good. Letting go is easier said than done, especially when pride is involved. One afternoon, as I was pulling weeds in my garden, Karen approached me hesitantly. I looked up, surprised to see her standing there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she cleared her throat and said, "Look, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry things got so out of hand." Her words caught me off guard. I hadn't expected an apology, not from Karen. Thanks," I replied, unsure of what else to say. "I'm sorry too. I should have listened to your concerns earlier." She nodded, looking down at her feet. "Yeah, well, maybe we can try to move past this." "Maybe," I agreed cautiously. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start. As Karen walked back to her house, I realized something important. Forgiveness doesn't happen overnight. It takes effort, patience, and a willingness to let go of the past. The tree was gone, and our friendship, if you could call it that, was still fractured. But maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild something new in its place. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the empty space in my yard. While the tree was irreplaceable, perhaps its loss had taught me something valuable. That sometimes growth comes from letting go. Weeks passed, and life in the neighborhood gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy. Karen's house was repaired. The new siding gleamed brightly under the sun, and her windows sparkled as if nothing had ever happened. From the outside, it looked like the storm had never come. But I knew better. The memory of that day lingered, not just for me but for everyone who'd witnessed the chaos. It was one of those events people would bring up casually at block parties or over coffee. Remember that time with the tree? For my part, I tried to focus on moving forward. The empty space where the oak tree once stood became both a reminder of loss and an opportunity for reflection. Mark suggested planting something new, a smaller tree, maybe, or even a garden. At first, I resisted the idea. How could anything replace what we'd lost? But as days turned into weeks, I found myself drawn to the thought of filling that void with something fresh, something alive. One Saturday morning, I decided to take action. Armed with gardening gloves, a shovel, and a bag of wildflower seeds, I set to work transforming the barren patch into something vibrant. As I dug into the soil, memories of the old tree flooded back. The way its leaves danced in the wind, the shade it provided on hot summer afternoons, the way it seemed to anchor my yard. But instead of dwelling on what was gone, I focused on what could be. By the end of the day, the area was dotted with freshly planted flowers, poppies, daisies, and marigolds. They wouldn't grow overnight, but I liked the idea of watching them bloom slowly, season by season. Karen noticed the changes too. One afternoon, as I watered the newly planted seeds, she walked over hesitantly. "Looks nice," she said, gesturing toward the patch of earth. Her tone was softer now, less defensive than before. "Thanks," I replied, giving her a small smile. "It'll take some time, though." She nodded, then hesitated as if debating whether to say more. Finally, she added, "I missed the tree too, you know. It felt like part of the neighborhood." Her words surprised me, not because they were unexpected, but because they revealed a shared sense of loss I hadn't fully acknowledged in her. Maybe she regretted cutting it down as much as I regretted losing it. For a moment, we stood there in silence, united by the absence of something we'd both taken for granted. As the weeks went on, our relationship began to mend, bit by bit. We weren't close friends, but we weren't adversaries anymore either. Small gestures helped bridge the gap. A wave across the fence, a polite comment about the weather, or an occasional offer to borrow tools. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The wildflowers eventually sprouted, adding bursts of color to my yard. Watching them grow reminded me that healing takes time and patience. The scars from the incident would always remain, but they didn't define us. What mattered was how we chose to move forward. One evening, as I sat on my porch admiring the budding flowers, I realized something important. Boundaries are essential, but so is understanding. If Karen and I had communicated openly from the start, if we'd listened to each other instead of assuming the worst, we might have avoided the entire ordeal. That lesson stuck with me, shaping how I approach not just my relationship with Karen, but all my interactions with neighbors. In the end, the tree's fall taught me more than I bargained for. It wasn't just about property lines or insurance claims. It was about empathy, accountability, and the delicate balance required to coexist peacefully. Life, like nature, has a way of surprising you. Sometimes, it takes losing something precious to appreciate the beauty of growth. And while I'll always miss that towering oak, I've come to love the vibrant patch of wildflowers that replaced it. A reminder that even after destruction, life finds a way to flourish again.